Today is the last day of our series with Professor Aziz Ismail, and it is supposed to be a kind of, we are expecting it to be a synthesis of what we had discussed during the last days, to have a short discussion, and then, well, to put in and nothing can stay forever. We cannot have anything forever. So as life is short, we'll have also a short session today, so please.
Yes, all right. All right. I want to begin by moving on, you see, from Kant, because Kant's I have to. Right. I said I want to go onwards from Kant, and then, because you see, for example, yesterday a question was asked about what is its relationship to the question of Islam reform, Islamic reform, but obviously these relationships manifest themselves gradually. It would be artificial just to say this is connected with that and that is connected with this. But because Kant in a way expressed what is the essence of the Kantian thinking, the essence of Kantian philosophy is that all our knowledge is from a human point of view. There is a book on Kant called The Human Standpoint. And that notion that our knowledge is always from a human point of view means that we have to think about objectivity in a very special way. If there is objectivity, it is human objectivity, meaning you cannot cancel, you cannot take the human mind out of the objects of your knowledge. And once you accept that, if you do accept it, and there are good reasons for accepting it in Kant's view, then when you come to matters like God, revelation, you cannot understand, you cannot no longer see revelation as something outside you, the concept itself, that the concept of revelation or even the concept of the divine is conditioned. It's not unconditional. It is a human concept. You see, God is an idea. Revelation is an idea. And those ideas are human ideas. See, that takes you immediately in a very deep way from orthodoxy, Islamic orthodoxy, because in Islamic orthodoxy, God is there. Revelation is given from above. But the idea of above is a human idea, you see. It's only in our spatial, even if you're using it as a metaphor, the metaphor arises from our worldly condition, you see. So that has a profound impact. And whether this is compatible or consistent with anything in Islam or not is an important question, but I think it is consistent, and I'm coming to that. But I want to come to that via a further development of Kant that happened, and it happened via Hegel. So I just want to briefly touch on Hegel. Again, we are doing, we're touching in a few minutes on things that usually are covered over months. But you see, Hegel was a great admirer of Kant, but also a critic of Kant. You see, he assimilated Kant's philosophy, and he said, he did agree that metaphysics in the old way was impossible. Metaphysics in the old way, meaning before Kant, where you thought that there was a realm, a world of God and of the divine or the soul, or of things like notions like freedom, that were out there and you can with your reason grasp them. But as Kant showed, that even when you see a cat in front of you, it's only partly an objective existing thing. What is objective is that if there is no cat, you have no sensations, no perceptions. But when you perceive a cat, you are building a cat in your mind. I hope that's clear, because you are not actually seeing a cat. You are seeing certain colors and certain shapes, which you then, in your mind, construct as a cat. When I say your mind, means the human mind is, all right. So in that way, God is, you see, all these metaphysical concepts like God, revelation are constructed by the mind. And let me just hurry, should I jump onto this or not? Because it is an interesting issue. You see, I raised this issue about whether there is anything in Islam which is where there is any coincidence. I'm using the word because in my mind I thought about three words: compatibility, consistency, and coincidence. But let's say coincidence. Is there anything in Islam that coincides with it? You see, it is very interesting that when Ibn al-Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, who was a was a mystic and a mystical theorizer, also wrote about mysticism. He talks about a God who is created in religion. It's a very striking phrase. You see, Al-Ilah, which is a God, Makhluk, is created, is generated, fil aqaid. Aqaid, the plural of aqidah is the creeds or the religions. Now he is saying, you see, here that the divinity is produced, is generated in the religion, in the faith. This is Kantian, and even more than Kantian, it is Hegelian, as we will see. But it is a coincidence. It's not that, and Ibn al-Arabi is not a systematic philosopher in the way that Kant or Hegel was, because Ibn al-Arabi is more of a practitioner, he's a mystic. And then he writes about it, reflects on his mysticism. So he comes to it from a very different angle, but sometimes people who come from very different angles suddenly, can, sometimes you find that in literature things are said which are also said in philosophy, but in a very different way. But that, in fact, was the insight of people like Ibn Sina, that the prophet comes to the truth in a different way from a philosopher does, but it is still the truth, still a truth, part of the truth. Now, Hegel, you see, what does Hegel criticize in Kant? He says, what is missing in Kant are several things. One, and they are interconnected. In Kant, there is no, this morality, moral notions, or the idea of knowledge, etc., are not situated. They are abstract. Kant is thinking in a universal way. But that universality, Hegel thinks, is abstract. And because it is abstract, he thinks it is empty. So when, for example, Kant talks about the categorical imperative, which is the call of duty and nothing but duty, and for the sake of nothing but duty, Hegel says this is empty because it doesn't tell you what our duties are. It does say that we obey the call of duty, but what are our duties and what are not our duties? And Kant's answer is that, we talked about that it is reason that, if it can universalize, then it is a duty. But Hegel says that still doesn't tell me enough. And the problem in Kant's thinking, according to Hegel, therefore, is that there is no content. And the reason why there is no content, well, no, not the reason why there is no content, but let's look at it from another point of view. If you do want content, and if you don't want it abstract or universal, which Hegel says you can't, life cannot be built on an abstract universal thinking. It has to be concrete. So if you want concrete contact, it can only be in a society. And societies exist in history, in time. So time and society have to be brought into the picture, and they are missing in Kant. So you see, at the most you can, what is this reason? Well, it is universal in Kant. And I as an individual am subject to, or I as a individual have the duty of consulting reason in a universal way. But Hegel says that's not how history moves. People live in society. And in society there are given norms, traditions of moral ideas. These are, Hegel calls them Sittlichkeit, customs. But you could also call them Sharia. I mean, this is why I'm making a connection. You were asking for a connection. That it exists there. Before I'm born into a society. And I'm born into with moral norms, traditions, customs to which I belong, and that summons me to act according to that. And this happens from birth onwards. You see, we absorb things, we assimilate things like, for instance, to stand up when a guest enters the room. We don't touch somebody, unless we have intimate relations. We stand at a certain distance from people. In some cultures, people stand at greater distance. We always say things like good morning or hello and salam alaikum and all that. You see, these are all customs that we are inducted into from birth, from our surround, from parents, from teachers, from brothers, sisters. So this is an objectively existing historical tradition, you see, that exists where we are inducted into it, and that has to be our basis for our morality, not the universal abstract system of Kant's, where there may be a way of bringing this together, but that's another issue, another question. Now, let's look at whether there is a problem in this. So we should always look for problems. Never, just accept anything taken for granted. I mean, it is interesting, but is there something that is a problem here? You see. So, anyone within 1 quick minute? Anything that arises about what can be an issue here, what can be a problem here in Hegel's thinking? All right, let me just say, one problem straight away. Then does it mean that we just have no way of judging or moving beyond our customs? We just accept them, you see, our customs. That's one question. You see, can those customs, the moral norms, if they are already there, does it mean that they have always to be there in that same form? What Hegel is saying, you cannot have a society that does not have these traditions. That I think we accept. But then all those, have those traditions to be there in the way that they are? Or can they change? So that's one question. The other question is, if traditions exist, we also find that these traditions are different in different cultures or different societies. So, is there any right or wrong about this? Now, Hegel is interesting because he doesn't answer these questions by, in the yes. He doesn't say, yes, we are just left with different traditions. Or he doesn't say that there is the tradition that you inherit as in a one society cannot change. Or he doesn't say it can change, but it can change accidentally, circumstantially. You see, that happens by, it just changes because as time goes on, like people change. That's not what he's saying, and that's what makes him more interesting. So what he says, now incidentally, Hegel is also talking about here, he's thinking, you see, there is something very interesting about Hegel. When he talks about society or culture, what is society? You see, we must always ask this question. We always say, yes, society. But what is society? You see? Now, is society a kind of plurality where you have a number of people, then they form a society? Is that right? If that was true, then we would form a society here. But I don't think we would say that this group here is a society. We would call it a group that has come together for a purpose, but it is not a society. There is something more to a society than just a group. There is more to a society than just a plurality of people. At a bus stop, you have a number of people, but you can't say that's a society. You would say it's a crowd. You wouldn't even say it's a group, you see. Unless maybe you are in Italy, because in Italy at bus stops they always talk, you see. So, because Italians are very talkative people. But even so, it's not a social group. So, what is society? And there is something very interesting in Hegel, which we can't go deep into. What Hegel says is that culture or society thinks that it is not the I who think, but there is a collective thinking going on, and he calls it spirit, Geist. You see, spirit, culture is spirit, which thinks, and it thinks through me. Meaning that anytime I think of anything anytime I think rationally in general, not when if I'm thinking of, I have to get to the doctor for an appointment today, maybe it's at 11 o'clock, so I should now take a taxi. Should I take a taxi, or whether, should I take a bus, or whether should I, change the appointment. Now that's individual thinking. You see, this is not spirit, Geist thinking. But it's only at that level that we think individually. And even when we think individually like that, we are thinking also collectively, because the idea of a doctor, the idea of appointments, in general, the idea of transport, these are very general concepts. They are not individual concepts. So spirit, Geist, is what it thinks. And what Hegel says is that spirit or Geist finds contradictions at some point. Now, when it finds contradictions, it wants to resolve those contradictions and move ahead. So what does that mean? Now let's take the examples, because we are trying to synthesize. Let's take examples from Islam to see what does Hegel mean by contradiction. So very simple example. The Geist, the spirit, says that the Quran is the origin of our norms, how to live. That's a given. I mean, it's given in the Sittlichkeit, it's given in the customs, in the spirit, in the culture. We think, it thinks like that the Quran is the source of the norms which should guide the life. But then we find that there is a problem. Do you switch off the machine of somebody who is in a hospital and is completely in a coma or unconscious and cannot think? Is like a vegetable. Now the Quran, you don't find that reference to that. Or etc., many other things like that. So what do? You interpret. So what has happened here? You have taken two steps. This is the Hegelian system. You have taken two steps. First, there is a given. The given notion is that the Quran is the source of our moral norms. That's number one. But you find that the Quran doesn't give you the guidance. See, it's not acting as the source in this or that manner, on this or that point. That's what Hegel calls negation. You have negated the original idea. First you said the Quran is the source. Now you are saying, but it is not the source in this matter. So you have seen a contradiction. Now you want to resolve this. When I say you, I don't mean any individual. It is the culture which is moving in this respect. So it says, how do we resolve this contradiction? Because we can't stay with that contradiction. So you develop the idea of an interpretation that comes from the culture. You see, it says there is such a thing as interpretation. So it's like Fazlur Rahman, you see, say, interpret in this particular way. Now, when you do that, you have taken a third step, which is neither the first nor the second. But, and this is what Hegel says, the first and the second steps have not just been pushed aside. They are preserved in the third step. You see, when you talk about the interpretation of the Quran, you have preserved the first step, which is that the Quran is still the source of your norms. You have not completely brushed aside the Quran. But the second step says that the Quran is not enough because it doesn't give us a guidance on this matter. So you negated it. It was because of that negation that you came up with the idea of interpretation. So the idea of interpretation preserves the first two steps but goes beyond them. See, that's what Hegel calls sublation. To sublate is to go beyond, but not by just ignoring or rejecting the earlier steps, but you preserve it. You see? Now, that's the question. But then, you might find that interpretation also creates a contradiction. The notion of interpretation then, at some point, produces a contradiction. Because when we say, but how do we interpret? Can we find any meanings in it that we want? What does interpretation mean? Now, you see, what are you doing? You are negating the idea of interpretation. And therefore, you have to find a third step again to preserve the notion of interpretation and the negation of interpretation in a new concept. And that is why, you see, Islam, from a Hegelian point of view, Islamic orthodoxy, all this that we discussed, with Fazlur Rahman and so on, is very understandable but insufficient because the next step has not been taken. You see, the problems with that notion have not been dealt with. That notion was an answer, but in giving that answer, you are producing a new contradiction that we have not addressed, you see. Let me give you another quick example from Islam again, and that is when Islamic orthodoxy was developed, the Sharia was developed, there was something called Sufism that came into being. You know about Sufism. Now, generally we want to know, if you are a student, you want to know what is Sufism. But from a Hegelian point of view, you don't say what is Sufism. That question is not very productive from a Hegelian point of view. From a Hegelian point of view, you don't ask what is Sufism, but what were the contradictions to which Sufism was a proposed answer. You say, what was Sufism an answer to? How was it negating something and trying to get past that negation? Now, if you examine that point of view, here is what I would suggest was the issue. The idea of God is an idea, and it's something that means a lot to people. So at some point we feel that the idea of God is not like the idea of a cat. There's a difference. Because when you think of a cat, you are separate from the cat. But when you think of God, you have a sense that you are also thinking about something about yourself. That there is a connection between you and the notion of God, that it is not an idea that of an object completely separate from you. But in the Orthodox Islam, in what we would call the Sunni, but I don't mean Sunni as opposed to Shia. By Sunni, I mean the Ash'ari and Ahmad ibn Hanbali point of view. In there, you see, God is there giving commands. And I am here accepting the commands. And there were people who felt that there was something problematic about this separation between the human soul and God. So they had a feeling maybe there must be something of a connection between the soul and God. And so they came with the idea that God is inside me somehow. So it was a very big step when the Sufis said, Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu, who knows himself knows God. You just see what a profound philosophical point is contained there. Although they are not thinking philosophically, it's a thinking which is not very explicit. It's happening intuitively. And what Hegel would say, it is an attempt to resolve a contradiction. Because first you talk about God and me, but then you negate it by saying there cannot be a God there and me here. There must be a connection there. So, first of all, you see the God and me as a problem. That's the negation. And in an attempt to solve that contradiction, you come to the point of view, man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbah. Right. But do you stop there? You don't stop there. Because that also now creates a new contradiction. The new contradiction is that if man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu, if there is an identity, then I am God, and God is me. So God is just another name for the soul, and the soul is just another name for God. So there is now a feeling this can't be right, because you cannot contain God entirely within the individual. It has to be outside as well. So originally there was some truth in saying that God is outside. But now we are saying He is both inside and outside. And so this dynamics went on historically, because you remember Mansur al-Hallaj, and we can't go into that history now. But Mansur al-Hallaj said, An al-Haq. And then, apart from the political problem that created because of the authority, apart from that, there is a philosophical problem there. In what sense am I God? And let me, because we are, the time is short, so let me just suggest one thing on the side here. Just by the way, in a parenthesis, as it were, is that in Islamic thought today, and we looked at those orthodox representatives like, just examples, but we could have looked at any number of, Muhammad Abdu and Maududi, and but we just looked at Fazlur Rahman, but we could have looked at others, etc. Isn't it, one of the very striking things is that no one has looked at the Sufi tradition in that respect. We're still talking about the Sharia all the time. And when we talk about the Sufis, we tend to reduce it. You see, the trouble with Sufism that modern people find that it is just a cult. It is emotional. It's not rational. It's not intellectual. And that may be true, that Sufism as it exists today is an emotional practice. But does it have to be that? You see, is there something in Sufism that that can be intellectualized, can be brought to the level of philosophy? Nobody has attempted this. Nobody has tried to do this, you see. And this is our limitation in the Islam, I have to say in the Arab world here. Because how much do we, in Iran, although there is a Shariati side, you see, of the Khomeini, the regime, but there are people at Qom, I believe, I haven't been to Qom, I don't know much about it, but there are people who, in places like Qom, who are actually doing a very different kind of work in Islamic studies from what you find in this Islahi system. So that's why Islah is very poor, is very impoverished. Classically, historically, the Ismailis, you see, who were called Batiniya, were a very interesting group because they actually, in a Hegelian way, they went beyond the Quran by saying that the Quran is a zahir, but there is a batini meaning which is hidden, you see. And on that basis, they developed the whole system. Now, our problem is that we tend to think too much along sectarian lines, you see. So we only stick to, you don't have to be an Ismaili just to take an intellectual interest in Ismailism. You see, you can study Ismailism intellectually. You don't have to be an Ismaili yourself. You can be don't have to be a Shia. You don't have to be a Sunni. You see, I mean, I have been talking here about Islah, but I'm not. You see, I'm not a Sunni. But that doesn't matter to me because I'm thinking as a philosopher, not, I mean, not as a religious person. From a philosophical point of view, you have to take yourself out of these groups to which you belong. Now, I just want to, yes, we still have about 15 minutes, I think. So, now, this is a perpetual movement, according to Hegel. Contradictions arise, you negate. So when the contradiction arises, you try to go beyond it by achieving some kind of sublation. But then you will have a new. Is this a terminal process or an interminable process? Does it, but take one thing to be noted is that there is progress involved here, do you see? It's not like the postmodern point of view, which just says there are contradictions, whatever it is, and that's all. That's, there is no movement. And in Hegel, there is a movement which is leading to progress. Why is it progress? Because at any point, the point at which I have arrived has taken into account the problems with the previous positions. That's why it's progress. In an earlier position, I saw a problem, and I moved beyond that position by confronting that problem. That's why it's a progress. The same way that science progresses. You see, there is a relationship, because in science there is progress. You see, you doing, and then there is a, when, for instance, let's not go into details, but the way electricity, posed the problem to the gravitational theory earlier, and so on and so forth. You see, you see that your present paradigm does not sufficiently account for something new that you see in your own position. So there is progress. But the other thing that Hegel is saying is that this reflection which is going on, reflection. Why reflection? Because you see a contradiction and you try to solve it, is immanent. Now, what is meant by immanent? You see, it's not it's immanent, meaning that it is inside the system that you are moving forward. You see, from inside you are progress. The problem is inside your system, inside your thinking. You don't look at, say, Fazlur Rahman or Muhammad Iqbal, just examples, and then you look at Kant and you reject one or the other. That's not Hegelian dialectic, because you are not moving from inside. You are simply either sticking to this or taking something else in its place. Now, that answers one of the questions. That brings us to a very big issue. And it's important to see this issue. This is why Hegel says, if you can connect this with what I've just said, that a philosophy is not capable that philosophy, no, how should I put it? That the philosopher stands outside the system, is not inside it. So, for example, if you are grappling with problems of Islamic reform, as a philosopher, you are observing it. And philosophy has a contribution to make because it is a, well, I shouldn't say because contribution to what? No, philosophy has the value that it gives you a kind of an external observation of what is happening there, you see, inside. But the participants are inside the historical situation, and they have to move immanently. So there is intellect at work, but that intellect is from within the system that it is moving, you see. If you see what I mean. So in that sense, I think it was this Abdul Malik's group, right? Or and Abdul Wahid's group, you see, which brought up this issue of identity. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about, because you see, when we say Islamic, society, there is an identity there. And the philosopher does not talk as a Muslim. The philosopher talks as a philosopher, although he can observe what is going on inside the Islamic or any other system. But the change is the historical confrontation of problems, contradictions, sublation, etc., is something that the intellect, the spirit, Geist, is doing in that society, not from an external point of view. So in that sense, philosophy is limited, you see. Hegel puts it in a very well-known, now famous sentence, that the owl of Minerva takes to its wings, it flies only at twilight, at dusk, in the evening. You see, the owl takes to its wings only in the evening. What is he saying there is that philosophy only comes after, in the evening, not during the day, meaning that the work is done by the participants. You see, the philosopher observes it after the participants have done it and gives an account of it. In that sense, we have to distinguish between the philosophical viewpoint and the actual historical movement in that society. Now, does that mean that Kant is irrelevant, Hegel is irrelevant? Well, yes and no now. Yes and no in this sense, that if I'm a participant, now you see, I have found myself in my career in a very interesting, challenging and difficult situation also. Difficult intellectually, not practically. I'll tell you why, because you see, I used to lecture in universities. And in the universities, taught philosophy and literature. These were the two subjects I taught. And I had no internal, no challenges to confront, except just to make sure that I knew the subject. But then I was appointed, you see, as the Dean of the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. And when that happened, my responsibility now was to help the community, both the Ismaili community and the other Muslim communities, because it's not really Ismaili, it's a broader Islamic. So it's to help in their intellectual development. And I found this a very challenging thing internally. Why? Because on one hand, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a communal believer, but on the other hand, I do know that, you see, there is a community that needs help. And it needs intellectual help. And there, you see, you are trying to do two things which are quite separate. And in my experience, for instance, you see, when I'm talking to a Muslim group, a Muslim community, I find that if I mention Freud, I did mention this, so that's why I once in a lecture. So I'm using that example. People didn't really respond very well. I mean, they didn't oppose it, they didn't criticize it, but they weren't really very responsive. And afterwards I thought about it. And I said, why is that? And I realized what it was. It was a Muslim audience, and Freud they could not relate to as insiders. So what I did was I took Freud's idea, and there was a story, or a story from inside the Islamic community, Indian Islamic community, which actually said something very similar to what Freud said. And I left Freud aside, but I made the same point by telling this story, and they responded better. You see, it's something similarly to slightly similar to what Professor Abdul Aziz Sachedina was a professor in America, a Muslim Ishnashari Shia person originally from, I think, East Africa. He went to give a talk in Saudi Arabia, you see, and he was talking in English, and he found that the audience, they could understand English, but they were not very responsive. So he switched to Arabic, and he was making the same points, and the people were excited, you see. So this is a psychology. Now, that psychology has to change. I think you can't be too parochial like that. The psychology has to change, but it has to change, in Hegel's words, immanently, from inside. And this is why, to do the kind of job that I was doing, and which some of you might find yourself doing, you have to be like the prophet. You say, who is a prophet after all? The prophet is like a statesman. He's gifted with intellect, but it's not a philosophical intellect because he's inside the society. And Hegel calls somebody like Muhammad, Hegel doesn't talk about Muhammad, obviously, but somebody like Muhammad, for Hegel, he uses an expression called the world historical individual. The world historical individual. This is an individual who intuitively sees his own time, he feels his own time, he feels the contradictions in his own time, and he wants to move ahead of that. Not as an intellectual, but as a practical person who is also an intellectual. You see, it's combined. One thing Hegel doesn't like about Kant is the separation between knowledge and morality. You see, between the theoretical and the practical. He rejects that. He says they exist together. So from that point of view, the Quran is a kind of a Hegelian answer to the perceived contradictions of the time. They are perceived by the prophet. And he is trying to get beyond them by sublating, you see, the fixed positions, taking something from the existing culture, but also trying to move ahead immanently from inside. You see, it's quite fictitious, this notion that everything, the slate was wiped clean, and revelation came and started something completely new called Islam. And so you have pre-Islam and Islam. You see, Jahiliyyah and Islam, and there is nothing. There is a line, iron, in Churchill's words, Churchill speaking about the Cold War, an iron curtain between the two, which you can't cross. It's not like that. The Hajj is the Hajj Islamic, pre-Islamic, You see, it's the same thing, but it's given a new meaning. An old thing that has been given a new thing. You see, that's why Hegel is quite interesting, because there are these insights coming. Now, just one or two things I want to add, and I will just state them very quickly. Hegel thinks of God as the perfected spirit, when all contradictions are resolved. So in a way, what Hegel is saying is that God, when you are thinking, it is God thinking through you. So when the Islamic community is moving, it is God who is moving through them. So God is not a fixed entity either. God is a development. In a way, the Quran itself realizes this. When it talks about Moses and, Jews and the Christians and the Muslims. Unfortunately, after Muhammad, the decision was made by the Muslim community and the Khilafah that after Muhammad there can be nothing, no further movement. The last prophet. But supposing it hadn't been like that, you see. But we have to find a way of moving beyond that system. The other thing I just want to say is that the question of identity. In a few minutes, there is we haven't talked about Heidegger, but I just want to use one little thing in Heidegger. Because what Heidegger says is quite interesting, Heidegger's philosophy, and it is quite parallel or quite close to Wittgenstein's. But we don't have time to talk about Wittgenstein either. But what Heidegger is saying basically that the reflection, theoretical thinking, is not primary. To start with, we don't think in a theoretical way. We just live. He is building a table. He uses a hammer to drive the nails. But how does a carpenter use the hammer? He, without looking, supposing the hammer is here, the carpenter is looking at the table and he picks up the hammer. He doesn't examine the hammer. He just picks it up and he then uses it to hammer the nail. Supposing one day he picks up the hammer and uses it, but the hammer is broken. At that time, when it is broken and it doesn't work, Then he says, what's wrong? Now it becomes a hammer because there is a distance. You see, he can't automatically use it now. By its becoming a hammer, meaning because it is broken, because it is not functioning, it's become an object of attention. Whereas previously, it was an object of spontaneous use. Wittgenstein talks a lot about meaning as use. It would have been very interesting if we had time to talk about the meaning of meaning in Wittgenstein. But the meaning as use, you see, the hammer is simply taken in hand and used, not thought of as a hammer. But you think about it as a hammer when it's not working. And so the last issue I will say in a very pithy way, because we don't have time, is that the problem with reform, Islamic reform, is that we think about it as reform. We should undo that title, because we are thinking of it like the man looking at a hammer. You see, when you think about reform, you are no longer able to do reform. Because when you are inside and changing the issue, you are not thinking of it as reforming. It is being reformed by Geist, you see, as Hegel would say. You are not thinking of it under that label. So Islamic reform will happen when the word reform is forgotten. When people are dealing with specific issues like crime, like women, like criminal law, etc., but not thinking of reform. So it will be the lawyers and the doctors and the religious scholars and practitioners and politicians and etc., judges who will move the agenda forward. And you, if you are philosophers, will observe it happening and you have a role. But your role is because your intellect, philosophical intellect, is different from the intellect of those participants. Thank you.
And again, thank you very much, Dr. Ismail, for these last words. If I were to propose or suggest a title for the whole cycle of lectures, I would say benefits, something like benefits of standing outside. You have been showing us, or attempting to show us, the benefits of standing outside, what could be also described, in other words, as a kind of Copernican revolution. In his time, Copernicus faced a kind of a majority view that it was the Earth that was at the center and that the sun was revolving around it. But he proved that it was rather the opposite, that it was the Earth that was revolving. So it's something like that, yeah, that you have been inviting us to do through work on Kant and through also these allusions to Hegel. So I thank you again and invite the colleagues for a discussion which should last something like 1 hour if you want. Yes, please. So please, if you have any reactions, do not hesitate.
Well, first of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Aziz Ismail, for enlightening us, for provoking our thoughts to think, outside the box and try to, reflect on some of the issues pertaining morals, ethics, social norms, identity, Islamic reforms, and so on and so forth. I would like also to thank the moderator, Professor Abdul Filali Ansari, and the professors who helped us, moderate the group discussions, and all the colleagues and, the participants who also, tried as much as they could, though sometimes our domain, field of interest is a bit different, but we tried as much as we could to get the gist and try to follow with you, sir. So I have like a direct question concerning when you talked about social norms, because I always, to be honest, like it's a mistake I always do, which is like sometimes I use the terms interchangeably. Norms, values, ethics. So the question here is like direct. How can we make a distinction between norms, ethics, values, and morals? And if norms are changing, does it mean that they are not morals? If there is like a certain social norm that is changing or it changed, does it mean that it is no longer considered as a moral? If it is, of course, taken from the Islamic, for example, Aqidah or...
Yes. Yes, the words don't matter so long as the gist or the essence is something we understand. And what is common to all these words is that they contain the notion of an ought, something that should be or ought to be the case, not something that is the case. Although the ought is sometimes put as an is, and I'll give you an example. You see, when somebody says to a child, it is wrong to lie, so they're using the word is, but essentially what they are saying is that you ought not to lie. You say, from that point of view, Kant is very useful because it says it is a categorical imperative. That's what defines norms. And I don't mind using any of those words, moral, ethical, for our purposes here. I think, there's partly a problem. Whenever we think that we are all subject to the mistake of thinking that whenever there is a word, there is an object. But there are words, there is no object, and usually language is quite untidy, it is repetitive, you have more than one word for one thing, etc. And there are words which have no object at all. So I wouldn't worry about the difference between those words. I would simply think of the difference between just facts and norms, which are in Kantian term categorical imperatives. Now, are norms then unchanging? And if they change, do they cease to be norms? The thing is, and there Hegel is very useful. He's saying norms don't apply abstractly, but only in situations. Norms exist in life. So in Kant, I think it is difficult to conceive of normative change. Kant's philosophy does not allow for change because duty is duty. Reason is universal reason. And so you cannot conceive of a duty as not being a duty. There would be a contradiction. Either you have thought of something which is not a duty as a duty, in which case you have made a mistake, your reason has not been good enough, But, or you have understood the duty, in which case it is a duty. But you cannot, what is duty cannot change from being a duty to not being a duty in the Kantian terms. In that sense, it is fixed, whereas for Hegel, norms are situated in history and they become defective. Norms become defective when you see that they don't fit the conditions of the life. And that the way you think about the norms does not match with what those norms demand. And a contradiction arises. So then the norm changes, but the norm doesn't stop being a norm. It becomes a fuller norm because you have dealt with the contradiction and a new normative position arises, and the new normative position has the old in it, but it is transcended. It's in a way like, think of a seed, you see, growing into a tree. Or think of a bud growing into a flower, blossoming. Or think of a caterpillar, a larva, becoming a butterfly. The flower has grown beyond the bud. The butterfly has emerged from the larva. But the larva is in it, you see, it's not a foreign object. In a way, the butterfly has, the larva is part of the butterfly, but it has emerged from it into a new shape. The bud has grown into a flower, but it is not like something from outside. The bud is contained in the flower. It's still part of the flower. So in that sense, the norms change, but they don't stop being norms. They become part of another normative form. You see, Hegel has an expression there, shapes of spirit. It's a shapes change. But it is still the spirit, the normative spirit, which is at work. Okay? Yes.
First of all, I would like to thank you so much for this wonderful and enlightening seminar. It definitely stayed with us even when we go back to the hotel. And thank you for everyone here for all the discussions and all. My mind has been stuck on the idea of like the universality of reason. Can reason be universal? And I kept thinking about on the way here, there was a radio show with a lot of discussions about if women should work or not. And there was this interesting intervention saying that we've strained far away from religion so that now women work, therefore any money that women make is haram. For me, is haram, yes. For me, there was no reason in it, but I'm sure that there was some kind of reasoning behind that in his mind. But that pushed me to rethink, like, if that is the case, if it is very subjective, then who gets to decide? And same thing about duty. Duty to whom? And who gets to decide? How can we make a moral code that is very universal? Is it by being deterministic in certain aspects? Like, for example, lying is wrong, therefore you can't lie, even if it's just like a little lie, harmless lie. Yes, that is all. Thank you.
I think that The way we have been thinking via Hegel is very useful here. And just to take up your last example, about lying. There comes, we start with the position that lying is bad. Or let's say, yes, we start with the position that lying is bad. But supposing this happens, that there is a riot between, let's say, Hindus and Muslims in India. This sorts of things happen, so I'm just using this as an example. Supposing there is a riot between Hindus and Muslims. Supposing there is somebody's home, Hindu or Muslim, doesn't matter. But he gives shelter to a Hindu running away or a Muslim that is running away in the house. Actually, this happened once in a political situation, Indira Gandhi situation, but I don't want to, we don't have time to go into that. And the person from the opposite side comes, bangs at the door and says, "Is this chap hiding in your house?" And what will this householder says, "No, there's nobody here." Because, this used to happen in Nazi Germany. Some people gave shelter to Jews. And then a Nazi policeman, SS policeman comes. "We hear that there is a Jew hiding in your house." Said, "No, there is nobody. Come and look." And you see the man hiding is in the roof, above the roof or something like that. So the man in the house has lied. But is that lying wrong? You see, most people would say, no, in that instance, you have to lie rather than tell the truth. So what is now happening is that the notion of lying is a notion of not telling a lie is not rejected. You see, Hegel wouldn't say there is no sense in saying that lying is wrong. He would never say that. He would say it was quite right to say don't lie. That is a moral position. But in a particular circumstance, the moral position seems problematical. It's not that it was wrong to say that, it was wrong to say that lying is wrong. But in that given situation of the Jew hiding in a house and the German, the Nazi knocking at the door, the notion of not lying, the norm of not lying, becomes problematical, so it becomes qualified. And then, if you reflect on it, you come up with a new norm. And that new norm is, don't lie unless by lying you are doing some good, some objective good. You see, so your norm has changed. So with the case of women, whether they should work or not, from a Hegelian point of view, we have to be sympathetic to the notion that women should not work, to start with. Because there were circumstances, there was a time when women, there were reasons to think that women should not work in agricultural societies, when there was labor involved, when, for instance, families, there was no birth control. So there were many children, and the man was out working in the field all day long, and the mother had to, look after the children. It made sense. We should, we mustn't just reject these things. But in contemporary society, it doesn't make sense to hold on to that notion, because the circumstances having changed, and the fact that the economy benefits from women's work as much as from men's work, and that women are equally qualified to work as men if they have the talent, all these circumstances begin to force us to revise the old notion. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That we tend to sort of clash, to say this is right, this is wrong. Let me give you an example. There were times when in agricultural societies, the more children you had, the more you would prosper, because there would be more people working in the field. And it is understandable there that they felt that somebody who was not marrying, let's say there was a boy who was, say, homosexual, but who wouldn't, marry because he's homosexual, they would say, this man is stopping, is it because if you don't marry, you don't produce children. And if you don't produce children, you set back the cause of the family in that situation. So you have to look at this sympathetically. There were reasons why homosexuality was considered bad. But maybe now, and also, don't forget, in the old days, people, the belief was that homosexuality was something that people decide to be, Somebody decides to be gay. Now, we know that there is a very strong evidence. It's not completely settled, but there is evidence that the part of what makes people gay is genetic, that there is a genetic disposition. Now, if there is a biological genetic basis to it, you can't say that people should not be, because there is no should involved when it is nature. Also, if you look at it from a Freudian point of view, which is it's not genetic, but the notion is that that this orientation is set in very early, the first 5 years of one's life in childhood, so that one cannot do much about it to change it once you grow up. Then your attitude changes to the norm. So I agree that today you cannot say that it doesn't make sense to say women cannot work. And but we have to look at it that way, that there was a reason why women might not, the idea of women not working was in place. The problem with the ulama who say it is haram is that they are just sticking to one notion and not looking at how that notion becomes problematical in a different situation. But the secularist or the anti-ulama person is also dogmatic, because it says no, women should work, full stop. In the 5th century, in the 13th century, in the 19th century, and so on. But then somebody might say, well, if women work, what happens to children, small children? So that's a new challenge now that you have to resolve in one way or another. It's not always easy, but there is thinking involved. You know what I'm trying to say in one word is that this has to be collaborative thinking. Everyone has to be a partner in this thought. The secularists, the fundamentalists, everyone has to be involved. And those fundamentalists who don't want to talk at all, who don't want to reason, have no place in that debate. But now I will also say at the same time, those reformists and secularists and so on who don't want to think or don't want to talk and don't want to compromise or don't want to indulge in reflection, they have no place in it either. There is dogmatism on both sides. I've lived in the West for most of my adult life. I find a lot of this feminist discourse in the West very problematical. I don't agree because it's very dogmatic. It's very absolutist. And unfortunately, postmodernism doesn't allow us to go beyond it because it just says, well, it's somebody's construction, it's another person's construction, you can't, there is nothing to be said about it. All right? Yes. Yes. Abdullah, yeah.
Good morning again. Thank you, Professor and Dr. Aziz, for all the insightful lectures. Thank you for the mindful answers to all the questions. I would like to extend my gratitude also to my professors for joining us and guiding us through all the lectures and the discussions, which was a wonderful experience. I would like to extend my gratitude also to Professor and Dr. Filali Ansari for being a chairman of these lectures, and to the Academy of the Kingdoms of Morocco. My reaction is going to be on the concept of reform and reformism in general, which I would agree to a greater extent when you stated that it is a problematic concept since, and I have noticed this during the lecture, during the discussions, that the word reform might mean a total rupture with the past, in this context, with past Muslim heritage. So if the idea of reform is a total rupture and compromising something that marks or identifies our own identity, that's not a reform. It's like you're starting from scratch. So why are we going to do it in a way that we are going to say that Islam is either this or this? It's either a necessary distinctive set of traditions grounding Muslims' identity, or an entity that fosters self-understanding. Why not combining them both to develop and not reform Muslim thinking in a way that goes and aligns with the Muslim principle, the very Muslim Muslim principle which states that faith and believing in God and believing and being a Muslim comes from the idea that you are not inheriting the religion, but rather you are believing in God and Islamic scriptures by knowledge. The same as an idea that aligns with Kant's idea or points on the source of knowledge, where he states that knowledge comes from humans' reasoning. And here, I will take two examples, philosophy and ijtihad. So if we are going to develop, not reform, Muslim thinking, it can be a way explained that this happens through ijtihad, where people are doing their best to come up with a version of the religion that aligns with the time changes and the historical events and the modern problems. But in a way, one might state that it is somehow limited because ijtihad in its principle is just an interpretation of the already existing scripts and principles of the religion, while philosophical reasoning depends on human reasoning, basically, and does not only depend on the reinterpretation of scripts. So why not combine it both? Thank you.
You know, one way to go beyond this issue, and you are right, you know, reform can be seen as a rupture. Although, you know, there's Professor Arkun said something about rupture, that rupture has already happened. That is not something that we are bringing about, because today's Muslim societies have very little in common with Muslim societies from before. That's an interesting notion, that it's not, you know, that we are creating a rupture, but rupture has happened. So what do we do now that rupture has happened? But in the end, it's a matter of going forward. But what I'm trying to say is that the problem is, you see, there is a problem with this, the basis on which we are trying to move forward. By using the idea of reform, perhaps, you know, if I have said this in the past, supposing we had a drug that you could inject in a person, and that drug could just cancel out 1 or 2 words, make you forget 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 words, and not others. Now, there is no such drug, because the nervous system, the brain doesn't work that way. You can kill the brain, but you can't just, or you can kill part of the brain, but you can't just kill 1 word or 2 words and leave the rest of the language aside. But maybe, you know, in the future, who knows? But now, if there was a drug like that, I would say, let's have a drug that makes us forget the word Islam, that makes us forget the word Islah also. And just let us deal with the issues. I'll give you an example. Thomas Kuhn, you know, I mentioned before, is a philosopher of science. And he says there are times when the scientists are solving an issue, cannot solve a problem, and the whole paradigm changes, like as in Copernicus. Because, you know, when they believed, very quickly, in the astronomy, when they believed that the planets, that the Earth was at the center and the planets were moving around, then they had measurements to explain why the planet is there and not there. Under Ptolemy's system, there was a mathematical system for explaining this. But there came a time when Mars, the planet Mars, seemed to move forward and then suddenly to move backward. And the existing model or paradigm, the mathematical calculations and the existing theoretical tools could not explain this strange phenomenon that for a while the Mars moves forward and then moves backward. I mean, why does this happen? What is making it happen? And so in trying to explain that, what Thomas Kuhn said, the whole paradigm changed. So the first paradigm was that the planets are moving around the sun, but then the paradigm changed, not just with Copernicus, because it was a gradual, Copernicus only comes at the end of, you know, many other scientists who were gradually changing this. Then the paradigm changes to the Earth being at the center. But now, that's the important point is not that. The important point is what I'm coming to now, is that the scientists were not looking for a new paradigm. And the scientists did not say, let's change the paradigm. Because the idea of a paradigm is of no use to a scientist. A scientist never thinks of a paradigm. It is the philosopher who says that the paradigm has changed. And if you tell a scientist, if a philosopher tells a scientist, your whole paradigm has changed, you know what the scientist will say? Is that, all right, has it? Fine, but it's of no interest to us, because all I'm interested is in explaining why Mars is going forward and backward. I've tried to solve that problem in this way. So this is a richness that the scientist is actually dealing with a problem. He's not thinking of paradigms, changing paradigms or keeping to the same paradigms. That's only a philosopher who is looking from outside who thinks like that. Which scientist in a laboratory ever says, in the laboratory, does he say, now I want to change the paradigm? You see, he just says that this Petri dish has bacteria this much, and the bacteria have multiplied at this rate. How do I explain the rate at which the bacteria have multiplied? And in trying to solve that problem, the philosopher will say he has actually changed the paradigm. He might have. But if the scientist sits there and thinks about paradigms, and he doesn't look at the bacteria, he will be useless and he should be sacked. The actual scientist is only concerned with what is before him. And in that way, reform should take place without thinking about it as reform. Forget about the idea of reform. Just look at the problem and try to solve it. And you may move a lot from that angle. So perhaps you see, so that's what I would say. Not even think of whether this is Islamic or not, but let it be an issue which you are thinking from the inside. If you are thinking from the inside a Muslim society, it will be Islamic whether you like it or not. Because you are inside that society, you will inevitably using Islamic terminology. But don't, it's no use thinking, am I using now Islamic terminology or am I not? Is this Islamic or not? That is the path to a disaster once you start raising this question. No matter who raises it, whether it is a fundamentalist or whether it is a reformist or whoever. Also, one thing that you asked earlier, which I did not answer, who decides, you see, that issue? Everyone decides, you see. There isn't such a thing as anybody ever deciding or wanting to decide. That person who says that women working is haram has a right to say that. We must accept that, in a society, it should be the right of anyone to express their views. It only becomes problematical if they use political power to enforce those views. Then it becomes an issue. And unfortunately, when sometimes power is used, power can only be opposed by power. And that's politics. That's politics, and that's the tragic, in a way, our condition, that we have politics. And when politicians use power, you have to be in politics yourself. You can't do it by being a Foucauldian, thinker, because that's academic. You actually have to be in the political arena yourself. But so long as it is not being enforced, the most fundamentalist, whatever you call it, let's not even use these terms. Those views should be allowed, because you see, secularists sometimes don't want to hear these things. They don't want to hear about religion. I have found this, in the West, there are people, philosophers who don't want to hear of religion, as though it was like a terrorist, idea. All right.
A quick question concerning the concept of reason in Hegel's philosophy. Besides the doubt and the criticism raised by contemporary philosophy, when reading or after reading some text by him on history, philosophy, and art, you may get that feeling that he was constructing his concept of reason according to the European standards instead of universal standards. Why I say that? Because he clearly and explicitly underestimated the contributions of other cultures, like African culture, Jewish culture, or Hebraic culture, Islamic culture. He misjudged these contributions mainly in art, in philosophy. For example, he said clearly that Muslims and Jews cannot construct any philosophy. There's no subjectivity in their culture. They cannot. It's something we can deal with. It's hard to underestimate the whole philosophy of Hegel, but still we need to revise this.
My answer to that is that what Hegel says about Jews or Muslims, etc., is a separate matter from the value or lack of value about issues such as contradictions and how they are resolved, how thinking has to be immanent in society, how God, the divinity, and the human self have to be reconciled. That's his philosophical contribution. Now, he does not need, thankfully he's not a philosopher who is saying, what can I get from Europe and what can I get from Africa or what can I get from Islam and so on. Because those things are not material to the reasoning involved in his philosophy. But when he says that, and let me give you an example. He says that eventually religion contains a progression from an otherworldly God to a God who is human and who is inside you. Right. And the example he uses is of Jesus. Now that's natural because he's living in a Christian world, he knows Christianity only. So he says, look, Jesus was thought of as God, but God's incarnation. But then Jesus dies. And when he is crucified, then he is present in the shape of the Holy Spirit in the ecclesiastical community, the church. So what has happened here is that the divine has become human finally in a social form. Right. We can estimate and evaluate this without, objecting to the fact that he doesn't know anything about Islam or Hinduism, etc., and he does not, draw anything from it. Understandable, totally understandable. But do I then accept his view of Islam? Obviously not. Do I accept what he says about Africa? No. Do I accept what he says about India? No, I reject it. But why should that stop me? Just as I said, you see, when Frege changes Aristotelian logic and puts a very powerful logic in its place, but Frege as a person was apparently racist and anti-Semitic. Do I then say, no, in his symbolism there is anti-Semitism? You see, that doesn't hold. So the idea of immanent progress, of contradictions and how they are resolved, and stand to rational scrutiny quite apart from what he thought of Africans. But if I want to think about, now let me tell you about this. In fact, I wrote a paper about this, on this issue of Jesus and the humanization of God. I wrote a paper on that. I've not published it, but I did show it to a Hegel scholar in London. And you know what I said is that in Islam there is a more powerful, in fact a very powerful basis for thinking about God becoming human. It is there, you see, even more powerful than in the Jesus image. I'll tell you why, because Nasir Khusru talks about in Persian that a human being's ultimate destiny is, in Farsi, Khoda Shodan, means becoming God. Because Khoda means Lord in Persian, in Farsi. Actually, it was Hegel, reading Hegel, who made me more appreciative of this notion. And in Sufism, you see, I quoted this Man Arafa Nafsahu Faqat. You see, there's a notion of the divinity in man. Hegel does not know this. And perhaps his prejudice, whatever it is, stops him from, studying. But so what? We do the same things, you see. I want to get away from this constant, from this Europe versus non-Europe, the West versus non-Western. There are issues there, but those issues do not stop us from appreciating what is of value in Plato and Kant and Hegel, etc. That is my position. But I'm not saying that Hegel is right on Islam. You see?
One of the criticisms
Yes.
addressed by Hegel to Kant is that
Because yeah.
especially when he tried,
there are three things here. One is Hegel is not talking about actual history. He's using the notion of history as a philosophical concept. He's not a historian. Now, he's a philosopher. But if, somebody did European history, let us say, and he brought out a lot of great value in Europe. You see, we don't say you are wrong because you are only doing Europe.
Yeah, from the beginning.
Yeah. If he only says that no, but there is no other history but only European history that counts as history, that's something else. He may still be a very good historian, but he is wrong if he says that only European history is worth looking at. You see? Now Hegel is only using history as a as a philosophical concept, except in the philosophy of art, when he refers to artistic traditions, or when he refers to philosophy, history of philosophy, and he does not look at other forms of art, that's very understandable, because he is a European, he is a man of his time. After all, how many Muslims look at Kant and Hegel today? You see, this is a problem only if we say that Hegel as a philosopher ought to have known everything, or ought to have had no prejudices. Then, but everyone is finite, everyone is limited, and everyone has prejudices. You can read, I find Hegel's history of art, for example, his comments on Greek drama, illuminating. If they illuminate me, then I go back and I can then look at my other literature. That is progress. Let me tell you, a quick, another personal thing. You say, I studied English literature for my first degree. I greatly appreciated Shakespeare. I greatly appreciated, metaphysical poetry, romantic poetry, etc., etc. My teachers, my professors were English. I had inherited from childhood a very rich, huge body of Indian, Indo-Islamic poetry. They are called ginans. My mother used to sing them. And there were vast corpus. This was not taught to us in our degree. These were English teachers who were teaching us only English literature. Should I blame them? I don't blame them. But they gave me, those studies gave me a way of looking at literature which enriched my looking at my own heritage afterwards. So I gained,
So
I
maybe
benefited.
there is a misunderstanding.
Yes.
Let's take the exactly the motivation.
Hegel does not say that these values are universal. Hegel says that values, or Kant does not say these values are universal. Kant says, because Hegel does not, Hegel says values are situated. In fact, that makes it closer to. But Kant says that values are universal, but Kant never says it is these values that are universal. There is no cultural component there at all, because he's saying universal. This is why Hegel criticizes Kant. He says it is very abstract. So you can't blame Kant, because he's talking as a philosopher. Kant never says that women should not be in parda, they should or should be. Because that's not, he's not even aware of these issues. We can't blame him. the man himself, if you look at his life, we don't know much about him, then maybe, you know, maybe he would have been very German, you know, in the food that he ate, in the clothes that he wore. I mean, obviously, he would not be a universal, you know, in his, the wine that he drank, or, you know, he would not say eating of pork is bad, right? So, but he never says that eating of pork, you must eat pork. Not because he is sympathetic to Jews or Muslims, but as a philosopher, that level does not enter into his thinking. So you should still, you know, we read him, we appreciate him, and but I don't have to eat the way he ate, you see. But those people who do say, but this is not, I can't never say this, Hegel does not say this, but those people who say that these are the values that are universal, like, you know, Western feminists, for instance, today. But we must not confuse Western feminists with Kant or Hegel. In fact, they don't read them at all. I mean, they are not very, you see, they are not philosophically sophisticated at all.
Okay, thank you very